Howie, we just had recent news. It was a very sad day. It's funny, we've been talking about the Maple Leafs for so long of what's happening on the ice. And we've talked about 1967 because it always gets brought up. And we talked about the Leafs curse. But one of the key members of that 1967 Stanley Cup winning championship team recently passed away. Ron Ellis, who I have a connection with, and we'll talk about that uh, from the off the ice standpoint. But it was a very sad day when we found out. A lot of people were connected with Ron. Ron worked at the Hockey Hall of Fame for many years after his professional career, and after he got out of pro hockey, he worked at the Hockey Hall of Fame. So there was a lot of connections with so many colleagues of ours, and it was very touching, the tributes that I saw when he passed, and was a big part of the NHL Alumni Association. He was a true gentleman and a true class act. And I know I was very sad when I found out that Ron Ellis had passed away at the age of 79.
I was at an all-day baseball function, and people were there from Toronto and all around the areas, and actually from the States as well. It was very nice, but when news came around that Ronnie Ellis had passed away, it was like a pall had hit the room, and I know from myself, just getting the news, I felt terribly sad all of a sudden because I know what he has meant to a lot of people. I know what he's meant to you, and just the stories that people were telling on social media, not even big famous people, people that had just run into him in parking garages and things like that. Just the stories of what a nice man Ronnie Ellis was. And I mean, we could talk about his career and we could talk about it for a while, but I mean, he had just won the Keith Magnuson NHL Alumni Man of the Year award for his post hockey life, of helping ex players with mental health issues and his work at the Hockey Hall of Fame. And then he's gone, and it's just like a kick in the heart for me, and I know for a lot of hockey fans, especially in this area.
It was really telling too, because a few people tweeted out how few players are left from that 1967 championship. You got to understand, Ron Ellis was really the baby of the group in 1967, and he's passed away at 79. So, there aren't a lot of players left. We've lost a lot of Toronto Maple Leafs from that 1967 club. And I know for your generation, I think it's hitting home to a lot of people. Like, that's sort of why I'm thinking there's so much angst with the Toronto Maple Leafs in the last few years of, they have this great team on paper, but they can't put it together. And it just feels like with each passing year, we're losing that connection to 67. And that generation, your generation, is going, wow, time's running out here. I really want to see a Stanley Cup championship for the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Well, I think too, Shawnee, it points out as we lose more and more members of that team. I mean, when Johnny Bower passed away, there was this large, huge, just feeling of sadness that went over the city because he was one of those people that everybody got connected to Johnny Bower in some way. It seemed like everybody had met him, everybody had seen him, talk to him at some point, and it would not surprise me if everybody had, because having met him myself, and seeing what a gracious person Johnny Bower was, and the kind of patience that he had, and the fact that he just got it, with people. He got his meaning to people, and he understood what he meant to people, and he just allowed everybody to take whatever time they needed with him. Ronnie Ellis was the same way, and as I saw pictures all over social media, after his passing, you know, in ceremonies at Maple Leaf Gardens, you could tell that the outpouring of affection from the fans was just raining down on him because he's got his hand over his heart in a lot of pictures, and he's looking up like he's surprised at this ovation, this appreciation that he got. And I loved seeing those pictures, but then to know that he's not around anymore, it made me very sad again.
I hear you, Howie, and that's how I felt yesterday as well. Just and even the colleagues and hearing their stories and why they were connected to Ron, whether it was through the Maple Leafs, playing days, but most part in the Hockey Hall of Fame, because when there were a lot of events, and there are at the Hockey Hall of Fame, you always see Ron. And I saw fans like on her Facebook group page talk about, they had scheduled, they were at the Hockey Hall of Fame on a trip, and who's giving the tour but Ron Ellis?
Yeah.
It's like like it's unbelievable. But that's who he was. Just one of the ultimate gentlemen. We say it a lot, but it is true with Ron. And I'll get into my story a little bit later. Let's talk about his playing career with the
Well,
Toronto Maple
I just
Leafs.
wanted I just wanted
Yeah.
to say one more story that I saw on social media. Somebody went camping at a campsite, and I don't know if it was Ron Ellis's campsite, but one day they go into the bathroom and he's cleaning the bathrooms in the campsite. He was no ego at all in the guy, just totally uh salt of the earth person anyway. Yeah, let's talk
Well,
about
it's
Ronnie
funny you
Ellis
say
playing.
that because I was just going to jump on you on that. The one thing, look, there are certain professional athletes who will milk it, right? They will milk their fame, their fortune, their status with a hockey club. Ron was. It never felt that way with Ron. Never. It was quite the opposite. He was a very humble man and individual, and you wouldn't even know he was a National Hockey League player. Uh, really, if you had met him off the street, you'd have no clue that he had played for so long in the
Hmm.
National Hockey League. And let's get into that.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's get into that, Howie. So right off the bat, he had junior success being part of the 1964 Memorial Cup team, and then joined the Toronto Maple Leafs, and was a younger player within the organization who, let's be honest, were sort of coming off a great run of Stanley Cup championships in the 60s, but they were getting much older collectively with the guys. And then, of course, in 1967, and obviously you can talk to more about that. He was the young guy on a truly veteran laden Toronto Maple Leafs hockey club.
That they always called that team the old man's club because there were so many guys that were over 30 playing on that team. You look at Johnny Bauer and he looked like he was 45 or 50 at that time. But he and Terry Sawchuk were the guys that were the tandem for that team. And you had Bobby Baun on defense. You had a whole bunch of other guys, Davey Keon, George Armstrong, so many guys, Eddie Shack playing on that team. And Ronnie Ellis, the young Ronnie Ellis, who he did score 20 goals in 11 seasons, which when 20 goals was meant something, but he was also an excellent defensive forward. And that was recognized a little later on in his career as well. But he scored 640 points in 1,034 games. He played all 15 years in Toronto. He was a four-time All-Star. As you said, played on the 67 Stanley Cup team. And he's one of 5 men to play 1,000 games in the blue and white as a Leaf. He's fifth in terms of games played as a Leaf. George Armstrong had 1188, Tim Horton 1184, Boreas Salming 1,099, Davey Keon 1,062, and Ronnie Ellis with 1,034. He scored the fifth most goals in Leafs history. And when he came into the Leafs, when he started with the Leafs, you know the story. Everybody knows the story. He wore number 8. And Ace Bailey, who had his number 6 retired after that big hit in 1933 that he took from Eddie Shore and ended his career. His number 6 was retired. But Ace Bailey, at the time that Ronnie Ellis came onto the Leafs scene, he was a timekeeper and a scorekeeper for the team. And he was so enamored with the way that Ronnie Ellis played the game at both ends of the rink and was able to score, but was also back to check in his own zone at the same time, or almost, while the game, same play. He was so enamored with the way that Ronnie Ellis played that he went to Ellis and said, "I would like you to wear my number 6." And Ellis said, "I can't do that. You're Ace Bailey. I'm Ronnie Ellis. I'm not a guy that can wear your number. It's retired." And he says, "No, I want you to wear my number 6." And Ace Bailey insisted. And Ronnie Ellis wore 6 the rest of his time in Toronto. And it's stories like that came out. I mean, it didn't come out. I mean, it's always out, but knowing that and his reluctance to wear number 6, but eventually acquiescing to wear it. That's Ronnie Ellis right there.
You can make the argument, Howie, if they had the Selkie trophy back then, he would be up for it year in and year
Absolutely.
out
Yeah.
for his style of play and how successful he was as a defensive forward. But as you said, was still able to pot 20 goals. And it was, we talk about it all the time in that era, the obstruction, the hooking, the holding, you name it. It was not easy to score 20 goals in a season.
And the stick work and everything else, that and the physicality of the game back then. I mean, and it was you had guys on every team that could fight. It wasn't just one guy on each team. It was, I mean, John Ferguson was marauding around for the Montreal Canadiens, but you had other guys on that team that could drop the gloves as well, and many did, and many wanted to get at Eddie Shack, and he would skate away or he would fight if he knew he could win. But it was that kind of a league back then.
Well, and the other thing is, he would have played against the other team's great players. And in that
Yes,
era, there were a lot of great players.
absolutely. You're absolutely right. But recognition kind of came his way when he got to play in 72 with Team Canada. And you look at who he played with. He played on a line with Bobby Clarke and Paul Henderson. And that line, he was one of 7 guys that played all 8 games in that series, in that tournament. And that right there is testament to how he was seen by the big people in the league and by people that knew hockey.
But the irony is, Howie, and we've done so many shows on forgotten NHL stars. Nobody talks about Paul or Ron Ellis uh, as that integral part of 72, even though he was on one of the most important lines
Yes.
from the 72 team.
Yeah.
And you put it exactly the way it was. It was to play on Bobby Clarke's line, and Clarke was the shift disturber, as they like to call it now,
Yeah.
and Paul Anderson was scoring goals, miraculous goals when the team needed it, and then Ronnie Ellis was that guy who was shutting down the opposition, the Soviet opposition, who had some unbelievable talent, as we know from 1972.
Well, Bobby Clarke shut down Valerie Harlamoff with one swing of the stick. You could say. But yeah, no, that line was out there against the good guys like Yakushev and Harlamov and Mikhailov. Those that was their big line, and guess who got to go out and defend? I mean, they weren't always successful, but the fact that they were out there and given that role, that talks about what kind of faith that Harry Sinden and John Ferguson and the brain trust of that Hockey Canada or the Team Canada had in that line.
And the value, think about again the tumultuous years of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And, Ron Ellis was one of those survivors.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, when a lot of guys didn't make it, through a long career in Toronto because of the shenanigans of the behind the scenes with Ballard, and Ellis was, I don't know if he was what you would call a good soldier in terms of didn't want to rock the boat with Ballard, but you never heard of anything out of the ordinary when it came to Ron Ellis and anything to do with Ballard or what was going on behind the scenes with those Toronto Maple Leaf teams.
Well, I can remember when I was in Little League, my coach was a guy who was a columnist for the Ottawa Journal, and he would write about people like Ron Ellis, and he would say he was a coach's player. He was all performance and no noise. Now, I'm sure that the whole situation did get to Ellis after a while because he was 30 years old after the 74-75 season. He had just potted his career high of 61 points, 32 goals, and 29 assists. He was 30 years old and he retired. It got to him to the point where he just couldn't play anymore. He didn't want to play in that atmosphere anymore. Took 2 years off. In 77, he went and played for Canada in the World Championships when they wore those kind of weird looking uniforms that are the jerseys that you only saw the one time, but there's a beauty in them. But and I would love to see Canada wear them again sometime, but I don't think we ever will. But anyway, he played for Canada in those World Championships, then came back realizing that he could come back and play, and he played 4 more years with the Leafs. Now, in 79, in the summer of 79, this is when all the stuff really started to happen Harold Ballard had fired Roger Neilson and had hired Jim Gregory, or fired Jim Gregory, and brought back Mr. Warmth, Punch Imlach.
Right.
And Mike Nicoluk was hired as the team's coach, but Imlach thought that Ellis was making too much money, and he was too old to deserve that money, and he wanted to cut him or waive him. Nicoluk protested, and Ellis got to play, the rest of that year. But 34 years old, Ellis, Imlach thought that he was too old, tried to buy out his contract. They couldn't agree on a number. So, Imlach said, "You're not worth the money we're paying you." The next year after that, Imlach put him on waivers. He told Ellis, retire or get sent to the minors. And Ellis retired. I know we talk about Punch Imlach a lot in a negative way. But personally, after the stories that come out and keep coming out and keep coming out, I'm just going to keep telling them. As I said, I call him Mr. Warmth because he exuded all he was Don Rickles like in terms of the way he talked to his players, and the way he drove them to have mental health issues, either while they were playing the game or after their career was over. And I'm sure now, Ronnie Ellis said that a lot of his depression issues and these issues were due to concussions that he got playing hockey. But I'm sure that a lot of what he suffered after the game was over came because of the way he was treated by some management types in the organization.
Oh, that's very true. And let's get into those issues. So Ron Ellis was really one of the first athletes that I remember that really came out talking about suffering clinical depression. And to the point where he literally was in his room and curtains drawn and in the dark for weeks on end. It was not healthy. It was not good. Now, as you said, he did write in his book that he feels a lot of it was from concussions that he suffered throughout his career, which we know now with everything that's come out, that he, may have had his bell rung 10 times. Who knows? Or maybe it was only 3, but the third one was a doozy. We have no idea how many concussions he has. He didn't know how many concussions he had, really. But in those days, it was like once you got your bell rung, you're back into the game. You're not taking 7 days off. It was a totally different era,
Right.
because they just didn't have the medical knowledge, nor, let's be honest, there was some ignorance as well, right? If you're not playing, it's costing the management some money when the guy's not playing. So it was just a different era for him. But he came out and did talk about it, and that is one of the points that was made upon his passing, was just how open and honest and how many people he impacted with his story. And it wasn't just him, it was also his wife, who was talking about how to deal with somebody with clinical depression. And that's where it struck my my nerves too, because and I'll get into the story in a bit here, but let's talk about that. That
Well,
was a very difficult era for anybody to go through that.
We talked about this before with Pat LaFontaine and the issues that he had with concussions and then the subsequent depression that he felt afterwards. And the problem with concussions and with brain injuries is that they're not a visible injury. It's not something that somebody can see. And so they look at a person who has a concussion or has a CTE and doesn't know it, or has a brain injury, as somebody, oh, they're just faking it. They're just milking it. Especially back then in the 60s, as you said, I don't see anything wrong with you, so get back out there and play. And back then, the players were just pieces. They were just property. I mean, to a point, they still are, but they're more well-paid pieces of property now than they were back then. Back then, as you and I have talked about many, many times. Guys had to have jobs in the off season just to stay afloat because the money they were making playing sports was not good enough. In Jim Bouton's book, Ball Four, in the '60s, he talks about guys making $5,000-7,000 a year. And that would be it. And it would be the same as a person working in an office, or, a guy working, in a store, or working on as a cop on the beat. It's not really sustainable when you have players making such little money. I mean, this is why Tim Horton went out and had built his own donut places, because he wanted to have some passive income coming in outside of hockey. It ended up turning out to be pretty good for Tim Horton and for Ron Joyce, but this is what people had to do. We had how many times have we heard about Canadian CFL players making barely livable money to play in the game that they love playing, and then their bodies and brains are racked by the time they're 30.
And then they're selling insurance in the off season.
Exactly. Well, that was a lot of people were doing
Right.
that. Mo Racine, I believe, was doing that. Guys are teachers in the
Mhm.
off season. Russ Jackson was a teacher and a principal after, either while he was playing or after his retirement. My uncle went to Rideau High School, where Russ Jackson was an algebra teacher, and said that he was his favorite teacher. Pretty sure I know why he was my uncle's favorite teacher, because he was a star quarterback for the Ottawa Roughriders. But when I told Russ Jackson that, I said, my uncle now, he's up in the stands, and he says, you were his favorite teacher. He says, he's up in the stands? I said, yeah. He says, boy, your uncle must be old. But anyway, that was reality
Well,
for athletes in the
yeah, and
60s.
Ron Ellis actually, I believe, owned his own sports store
Yes. Yes, he did. Yeah.
in Brampton, which is just outside of Toronto, part of the Greater Toronto area. Um, so yeah, Ron Ellis to me was. So I'll tell you the quick story. So someone who I was very close with was suffering depression, and it was it was difficult for me to deal with it at times, and just by fluke, and I honestly have no recollection of why I watched this show when I watched it, but I was at my mom's place and she didn't have cable, so there was only a select few channels. One of the channels was TV Ontario, which is a public television station in Ontario. And here is this documentary on Ron Ellis. And it was literally at 2 in the afternoon. It was just so random. And I had no knowledge of Ron Ellis's struggles uh, away from the ice. And that's pretty much what this whole story was about. It was him and his wife, and how Ron dealt with depression, how his wife dealt with him with his depression. And it was like this unbelievable moment for me, that it was like, wow. Like, number one, I relate to her, and I swear that's who my friend, that's what they have. Just the way he was talking and describing his symptoms and what was going on, and how he was dealing with everyday life. And it really helped me, helped them. And so fast forward, Ron comes out with his book, Over the Boards, the Ron Ellis story. So this would have been early 2000s. Kevin Shea, who actually wrote a beautiful tribute on Facebook yesterday, um, was the author, helped Ron write the book. And so I booked Ron for an in studio appearance. We did a show live at Wayne Gretzky's when Wayne Gretzky's restaurant was going, and I was producing the show. Paul Romanek was the host, and Ron came in and signed a copy of the book. But I got to eat with him and just talk to him and tell him what impact he had on me, my friend, and just how courageous he was to do what he did. And he did that for decades after, right? Like he's helped so many people. Thus, he was, the Keith Magnuson Award winner for the NHL alumni. But it was for all this work that he has done to help people deal with clinical depression. And again, in that time, nobody really talked about it. Well, again, I think you and I both echo the same sentiments that it's a sad day that, today as we're doing this show, just remembering Ron Ellis, what he meant to the Toronto Maple Leaf organization, what he meant to hockey fans that we know, friends, family. I know a lot of people I know were very sad yesterday
Yep.
hearing the news. So we'll wrap up this edition of the Sports Lunatics. And I'm Shawn Lavigne in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
And I'm Howie Mooney in Barrie, Ontario.
And again, please check out our website, thesportslunatics.com. Check out our YouTube channel, Sports Lunatics. We've been doing a lot more shorts and a lot more videos up on there. So please check it out. Give us a like, subscribe to our channel. It really does help us. Tell your friends and family who love sports history. We try to encompass today's sports into sports history. So there's something for everyone. And Howie, of course, we are in Ottawa.
Yes, on CKDJ 107.9 FM. Check us out on Sunday afternoons at noon. And we are there. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, and wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube at Sports Lunatics on YouTube. We've got a ton of stuff up there. And don't forget our website as well, thesportslunatics.com, where you can read a bunch of stuff that I've written. You can see a bunch of videos and audios that we've put together for you as well. Ton of material there.
And also you can check us out at the Fired Up Network. Have a great sports day, everybody.